World War II is usually remembered for its loudest moments. Armies clashing, cities burning, leaders making history in front of cameras. But some of the most decisive power in the war made almost no noise at all. This is not a story about dramatic victories or heroic last stands. It is the story of how Canada, without commanding empires or dictating strategy, became one of the reasons the Allied war effort actually worked. To understand why Canada's quiet strength mattered, we have to look not at the battlefield, but at the systems that made victory possible. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Canada did not appear, at least on the surface, to be a decisive actor in global affairs. It possessed no vast empire, no massive standing army, and no tradition of unilateral strategic leadership. In conventional narratives of power, Canada ranked well below the great states whose decisions and armies dominated headlines. Yet this initial impression is misleading. Canada mattered to the Allied war effort before it fired a shot in large-scale combat, not because of what it could destroy, but because of how it was positioned to make collective action possible. The central reason lies in structural relevance. Canada occupied a strategic position within the emerging Atlantic Alliance that no other country could easily replicate. Geographically, it sat between Britain and the United States, facing both the North Atlantic and the continental interior of North America. This was not merely a matter of distance on a map. In an era when transatlantic coordination was slow, fragile, and vulnerable, Canada offered continuity. It was close enough to Britain to understand its strategic predicament, and close enough to the United States to engage with its industrial and political scale. This made Canada a natural conduit rather than a competitor. Political structure reinforced this advantage. By 1939, Canada had achieved a high degree of legislative and diplomatic autonomy, particularly following the Statute of Westminster in 1931. It was no longer simply an extension of British policy, yet it remained deeply integrated into British institutions and traditions. This dual identity mattered. Canada could commit to the war effort with legitimacy, without appearing to be coerced or subordinate. For allies, especially the United States, before its formal entry into the war, this distinction was critical. Canada represented democratic continuity without imperial overreach. Equally important was institutional credibility. Canada entered the war with stable governance, functioning financial systems, and administrative capacity suited to long-term coordination. It did not need to improvise its state machinery under fire. This reliability allowed Canada to act early and decisively in areas that required trust rather than force. Planning, logistics, coordination, and standardization. In coalition warfare, these functions are often invisible, but they are foundational. An alliance cannot move faster than its least reliable link, and Canada reduced uncertainty at precisely the moment uncertainty was most dangerous. There is a quiet irony here. Canada's early importance stemmed from what it did not do. It did not pursue unilateral strategy. It did not seek symbolic dominance. It did not frame the war as a test of national supremacy. Instead, it focused on making itself useful in ways that others could depend on. In a conflict defined by scale and duration, usefulness often mattered more than spectacle. Understanding Canada's role before combat clarifies a broader point about modern war. Power does not begin at the battlefield. It begins in the structures that allow power to be coordinated, sustained, and directed. Canada mattered early because it reduced friction in an alliance that could not afford dysfunction. If Canada's importance before combat lay in structural relevance, its importance during the early war years lay in execution. The question was no longer why Canada mattered, but how it transformed geography and political stability into something far more concrete, a functioning logistical anchor for the Atlantic Alliance. In a war increasingly defined by scale, distance, and attrition, Canada's quiet strength emerged through reliability rather than visibility. The Second World War was not won by dramatic moments alone. It was sustained by systems, shipping schedules, production lines, repair facilities, and administrative coordination that rarely attract attention precisely because they are expected to work. Canada became indispensable by making these systems work consistently at a time when Allied logistics were under severe strain. Britain, isolated and under threat, required uninterrupted flows of food, fuel, and materiel. The United States, not yet fully mobilized, required time and secure channels to convert industrial potential into usable power. Canada occupied the space between urgency and capacity. One of Canada's most significant contributions was its rapid expansion of maritime infrastructure. Canadian ports on the Atlantic coast became critical nodes for convoy assembly, repair, and redistribution. Shipbuilding programs expanded at remarkable speed, not to rival the output of larger powers, but to close dangerous gaps in Allied shipping. In the Battle of the Atlantic, the loss of tonnage mattered less in isolation than the cumulative disruption it caused. Canada's growing merchant fleet and shipyards reduced that disruption by restoring continuity. Ships that could be repaired quickly returned to service. Routes that could be protected consistently remained viable. Industrial production followed a similar logic. Canada did not attempt to outproduce the United States, nor did it rely solely on British designs. Instead, it specialized in integration, producing components, vehicles, aircraft, and munitions that fit seamlessly into Allied supply chains. This reduced friction. Standardization mattered. Predictability mattered. In coalition warfare, a reliable contributor often proves more valuable than an exceptional but inconsistent one. Equally important was administrative coordination. Canada developed procurement, transportation, and labor systems capable of scaling without collapse. This required restraint as much as ambition. Rapid expansion carried risks, bottlenecks, inflation, labor shortages, but Canadian policymakers prioritized balance. The result was a war economy that could grow without destabilizing itself or its partners. In practical terms, this meant fewer interruptions, fewer emergency improvisations, and fewer cascading failures. There is a subtle but important distinction here. Canada's logistical role did not make headlines because it did not seek to. Its success was measured by absence. The absence of breakdowns, the absence of critical shortages, the absence of systemic surprises. This is not glamorous, but it is decisive. Alliances fail not only when they lose battles, but when they lose confidence in their own machinery. By anchoring Atlantic logistics, Canada amplified Allied power without overshadowing it. It allowed Britain to endure, and it allowed the United States to enter the war with a functioning transatlantic system already in place. This contribution was neither accidental nor inevitable. It was the product of institutional maturity and strategic modesty. Coalition warfare is often described in terms of shared objectives, but it is sustained by something more fragile: trust. Allies must coordinate strategy, allocate resources, and accept compromises under conditions of extreme pressure. In the Second World War, these demands were intensified by asymmetries of power. Britain carried the burden of early resistance. The United States possessed unmatched industrial potential. Managing this imbalance without fracturing the alliance required actors capable of stabilizing relationships rather than dominating them. Canada's quiet strength proved especially valuable in this role. The central reason was political credibility without threat. Canada was strong enough to matter, yet not powerful enough to intimidate. This combination is rare in major coalitions. Smaller states often lack influence. Larger states often provoke suspicion. Canada occupied an intermediate position that allowed it to function as a facilitator rather than a rival. It shared institutional and cultural ties with Britain while operating within the North American political and economic environment increasingly shaped by the United States. This dual familiarity reduced misunderstanding at moments when misunderstanding could have proven costly. Canada's non-imperial status further enhanced its credibility. Unlike Britain, it did not carry the burdens of maintaining a global empire. Unlike the United States, it did not project itself as an inevitable post-war hegemon. As a result, Canadian participation in planning and coordination was less likely to be interpreted as self-serving. When Canadian officials advocated for certain approaches, whether logistical priorities, training frameworks, or coordination mechanisms, their arguments were more easily received as practical rather than political. This credibility mattered because coalition war is not simply about aligning goals. It is about aligning processes. Decisions must be made about who produces what, who transports what, and who bears which risks. These are not abstract questions. They involve real sacrifices and competing domestic pressures. Canada's role was often to help translate between perspectives shaped by different strategic cultures. British planning emphasized endurance under siege. American planning emphasized scale and speed. Canada understood both logics, not perfectly, but sufficiently to reduce friction. Importantly, Canada's influence did not rest on dramatic intervention. It rested on consistency. Canadian institutions participated continuously in allied forums, committees, and planning bodies. This continuity created institutional memory and procedural stability. In long wars, such stability is a strategic asset. It prevents repeated renegotiation of basic assumptions and allows attention to shift toward execution rather than coordination. There is also a quieter dimension to Canada's contribution: restraint. Canada did not seek to impose itself as a decisive voice in areas where it lacked leverage. This self-awareness preserved trust. Overextension, political as much as military, can undermine coalitions as effectively as open disagreement. By operating within its strengths, Canada reinforced its reputation as a dependable partner rather than an aspirant leader. Coalition warfare succeeds when power is moderated by credibility. Canada's wartime role illustrates how influence can be exercised without dominance, and how trust can become a form of power in its own right. The alliance did not merely tolerate Canada's presence, it benefited from it. Waging a prolonged, industrialized war places extraordinary strain on societies, not only on their armies. The Second World War demanded labor, resources, political cohesion, and public consent over a period far longer than most governments initially anticipated. Many states met these demands by pushing mobilization to its limits, often at the cost of internal stability. Canada's experience followed a different path. Its quiet strength was expressed through measured mobilization, a strategy that prioritized endurance over intensity. From the outset, Canadian leaders recognized that sustainability mattered as much as speed. Mobilization expanded steadily rather than explosively. Industrial capacity grew in phases, labor recruitment was paced, and military commitments were calibrated to available resources. This approach was not without criticism. It could appear cautious, even hesitant, in comparison to the dramatic mobilizations of larger powers. Yet caution served a strategic purpose. It reduced the risk of economic dislocation, labor unrest, and political polarization, all of which could have undermined the war effort over time. Social cohesion was a central concern. Canada was not a monolithic society in 1939. Regional differences, linguistic divisions, and debates over conscription posed real challenges. The government's handling of these issues reflected an understanding that internal fracture would weaken external capacity. Rather than forcing uniformity, policymakers sought compromise where possible, preserving legitimacy even when consensus was imperfect. This legitimacy mattered. A war effort sustained by consent rather than coercion is more resilient, particularly in democratic societies. Economic management reinforced this resilience. Canada's wartime economy expanded rapidly, but it did so within institutional constraints designed to prevent runaway inflation and resource exhaustion. Price controls, rationing, and fiscal planning were employed not simply to maximize output, but to maintain balance. The objective was continuity, factories that could keep running, workers who could keep working, and supply chains that could function without constant crisis management. In practical terms, this meant fewer emergency disruptions and more predictable contributions to Allied needs. Military expansion followed the same logic. Training programs were scaled to ensure quality and retention, rather than immediate numerical expansion. Forces deployed overseas were supported by systems capable of sustaining them, rather than being pushed forward without adequate backing. This restraint reduced long-term attrition and preserved institutional knowledge, assets that become increasingly valuable as wars lengthen. There is an important analytical point here. Canada's restraint was not the absence of commitment. It was a form of strategic calculation. Total war does not reward exhaustion. It rewards those who can adapt, recover, and persist. By avoiding extremes, Canada maintained the capacity to respond to changing circumstances, whether in production priorities, military deployment, or diplomatic engagement. The result was a society under strain, but not under collapse. Canada remained governable, economically functional, and politically coherent throughout the conflict. This stability was not merely a domestic achievement, it was a contribution to Allied success. Unstable partners become liabilities. Stable partners become force multipliers. When the Second World War ended, the international system was profoundly transformed. Empires weakened, new institutions emerged, and the distribution of power shifted decisively toward a small number of dominant states. Canada did not emerge from this upheaval as a great power in the traditional sense. Yet it did emerge with greater influence, credibility, and autonomy than it had possessed before the war. This outcome invites explanation. Why did a country that rarely commanded the spotlight during the conflict gain a more prominent role afterward? The answer lies in how Canada had conducted itself during the war. Influence in the post-war order was not determined solely by battlefield victories or territorial control. It was also shaped by reputations earned through cooperation, reliability, and restraint. Canada had demonstrated all three. It had contributed materially without destabilizing alliances, participated politically without seeking dominance, and mobilized domestically without fracturing its society. These qualities translated into legitimacy at a moment when legitimacy mattered deeply. Canada's wartime performance reshaped how other states perceived it. No longer merely a peripheral member of the British Commonwealth, Canada was recognized as a capable, autonomous actor with experience in large-scale coordination. This recognition was reflected in its inclusion in post-war diplomatic and institutional frameworks. Canada was not present because it demanded a seat, but because its absence would have left a gap. It had become, in practical terms, a middle power, a state whose influence derived from competence and trust rather than coercion. This status was reinforced by continuity. Unlike many countries emerging from war, with devastated economies or shattered institutions, Canada retained functional governance, industrial capacity, and social stability. It could engage with post-war reconstruction, not as a recipient of assistance, but as a contributor to it. This distinction mattered. States that help design systems tend to shape their norms, even if they do not dominate their decisions. Canada's approach to post-war engagement mirrored its wartime behavior. It emphasized participation over leadership, problem-solving over ideology, and institutional development over unilateral action. This consistency reinforced credibility. Partners who had relied on Canada during the war could rely on it afterward. In a world increasingly defined by alliances and collective security arrangements, such reliability was a form of power. There is also a broader lesson in Canada's post-war emergence. The war did not elevate Canada by transforming it into something it was not. Instead, it amplified existing strengths, administrative capacity, political moderation, and a preference for cooperation. The war served as a proving ground rather than a reinvention. Canada's influence grew because it aligned its ambitions with its capabilities, avoiding the overreach that often undermines post-war states. By the late 1940s, Canada occupied a position that would have seemed improbable a decade earlier: influential without being dominant, autonomous without being isolated, and engaged without being overstretched. This outcome was not accidental. It was the cumulative result of choices made throughout the war, choices that prioritized durability over display. Canada's experience in the Second World War offers a useful corrective to how power is often understood. War is frequently narrated through moments of rupture, decisive battles, dramatic leaders, sudden turning points. These elements matter, but they do not explain endurance. Canada's contribution illustrates a different logic. In long, coalition-based wars, success depends less on visible dominance than on structural reliability. Quiet strength does not replace force, it enables it. At the core of this lesson is the distinction between power that commands and power that stabilizes. The Allied victory required both, but they were not equally distributed. Some states projected force at scale. Others ensured that projection could continue without collapsing under its own weight. Canada belonged firmly in the second category. It did not decide the war's direction, but it helped prevent the alliance from fragmenting under pressure. In complex systems, preventing failure can be as decisive as achieving breakthroughs. Canada's wartime role demonstrates that reliability is not passive. It is an active strategic choice. Maintaining functional logistics, credible institutions, and political trust requires restraint, coordination, and long-term thinking. These qualities rarely generate spectacle, yet they shape outcomes. Alliances fail most often not because they lack ambition, but because they accumulate friction, misaligned systems, exhausted societies, or eroded trust. Canada consistently reduced these risks. There is also a broader insight about moderation. Total war rewards those who can persist without exhausting themselves. Canada avoided extremes: economic, political, and military, not out of indecision, but out of calculation. This allowed adaptation as conditions changed. Quiet strength proved flexible. It absorbed shocks rather than amplifying them. In contrast, states that equate commitment with maximal exertion often find themselves brittle, unable to adjust once initial momentum fades. Importantly, Canada's experience challenges the assumption that influence must be asserted to exist. Canada did not seek recognition as a decisive power, yet it gained influence precisely because it did not compete for primacy. Its credibility rested on alignment between capability and behavior. This alignment made Canada predictable in the best sense of the word. Partners could plan around it. In coalition warfare, predictability is a strategic asset. The implications extend beyond the Second World War. Modern conflicts, whether military, economic, or political, are increasingly collective and system-dependent. They rely on networks rather than hierarchies, coordination rather than command. In such environments, states that specialize in integration, mediation, and continuity may shape outcomes disproportionately to their size. Canada's wartime experience offers an early example of this dynamic. To say that Canada's strength was quiet is not to diminish it. Quiet strength is not weakness. It is leverage exercised without spectacle, influence without coercion, and commitment without exhaustion. The Allied victory required states that could fight, and states that could make fighting sustainable. Canada's contribution lay decisively in the latter role. Understanding this helps clarify why Canada mattered in the Second World War and why its example remains relevant. Power is not only about who advances fastest or strikes hardest. It is also about who ensures that the system holds long enough for victory to emerge. If you found this analysis valuable, consider following for further historical breakdowns, or leave a comment on which overlooked contributors to global conflicts deserve closer examination next.